Hello, I just wanted to make another video, and this would be the video for Saturday night. There won't be any video for Sunday because we will be posting our service video, so I'd encourage your family to watch that, and I'd encourage you to find a resource to share with your children for bedtime stories then, but we will reconvene on Monday night. Chapter 3 of The King's Messenger by Carolyn Clare Gibbons. Just had to double check. The King's Friend. The whole castle was shining like a star. Everything from the attics to the cellars had been turned out and cleaned up. The king's messengers had been running all over the city for the past week, gathering new supplies, ordering lamb shanks and cake flour for the kitchens, seeing scribes about the invitations to the planned banquet. The atmosphere in the king's courtroom buzzed as if was static. The princes, dukes, and duchesses looked their best. It was an honor to attend this meeting of the king and his oldest friend. The king's childhood friend was coming to visit. When they were boys, the king and his friend spent every summer together. They had studied together as young men and traveled the world before the king's father died. Their friendship was famous throughout the kingdom. There was a saying that people used when someone had helped them. "You're a king's friend." The king's friend served him as an ambassador to a neighboring kingdom. It was a tricky political relationship, and the only someone the king trusted implicitly could handle the job. Smuggins had never seen the king's friend before, for it had been many years since he had visited the king's courtroom. So today he stood straight and tall, ready to step forward if he was called upon, and say, "At your service, your majesty. Yes, your majesty." Smuggins looked around the room, proud to see that his week's work had done some good. The silk of the king's shirtwaist was from a merchant on the far side of the city, and Smuggins had gotten it for the tailors. A duke standing against the far wall was only here because Smuggins had delivered his invitation. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, a commotion was heard outside. Horse hooves clattered in the courtyard, and a booming voice was heard in the hall. The doors of the courtroom opened, and the king's friend entered. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black and silver with a light sword hanging from his left hip and a long dagger on the right. He approached the king's dais and bowed with a flourish, saying, "Your Majesty." The king's smile was broad as he stood from his throne. Stepping down from the dais, he grasped his friend by the shoulders and then embraced him. "My good friend," the king cried, "it has been too many years." "Aye, far too many," the king's friend replied. "I have chosen all your favorite dishes of the old days of our meals tonight. I hope your taste has not changed after so much time eating exotic foods." "Not a bit," the king's friend smiled. "Though I certainly hope your chef is better than the one we used to have at the shore palace each summer." The king laughed aloud. "No one could be as terrible as that old cook. I wonder why my father kept him on." "Do you remember when we complained about the food, and your father told us it would build character?" "It built nothing but indigestion," the king chortled, and his friend laughed with him. The spectators in the courtroom smiled to see their king enjoying himself. The king and his friend continued to laugh and talk as they led the way into the banquet hall. The king's brother, the royal prince, and his wife followed, leading a train of royalty and nobility seen together only on the most festive of occasions. After all the courtiers, see, even I have trouble with this stuff, had left the king's courtroom, the messengers filed out and entered the king's presence in the banquet hall. It was an event to be remembered for a lifetime. The chef had crafted a feast of soups and meat and roast fowl with the cracklin still dripping from the crisp skin. The vegetables had been plucked from the castle gardens that very morning, and Smuggin's mouth watered as he took in the table laden with fluffy cakes and golden pies. The nobles did the feast justice. But the best part of the whole evening, Smuggins thought, was seeing the king and his friend together, sharing laughs and smiles. In that one evening, Smuggins felt as though he saw their whole history together. The next day, the kingdom was abuzz with reports of the great banquet. Smuggins and Misha had been called upon by the king to go out into the city and take a letter to the royal prince's palace. As they walked through the streets, they overheard snatches of conversation in the market stalls along the walkways. They say that he had a chef make his friend's favorite foods. I thought there were 15 steers butchered for the meal. They've been friends since they were young men? Longer, I'd say, since they were born. And his friend had served him so long in that foreign place. Yes, a lifetime of serving his king in another land. As Smuggins and Misha wound through the old city, Smuggins began to think about the king's friendship. Just as he was wondering if he had any friends so dear, Misha spoke. So, Smuggins, do you have a friend like the king's? I was just asking myself the same question, Smuggins laughed. I don't know. What makes someone a friend like that? I think, said Misha, I think it's about being a friend in the good times and the bad. I watched the king and his friend last night, and you could see that there were a lifetime of experiences together. I think they faced the happy times and the sad times together. I think that they've challenged each other when one has been doing something wrong, and stood up for each other when everybody else was against them. Smuggins thought for a moment, and looked back in his life. He smiled a little wryly and said, Well, Misha, if you put it that way, then I'd say that you are a friend like that. You stood up for me when everyone else thought I was not worthy to be a messenger, because the king had never called on me. And you challenged me to remember to serve the king when I got all caught up in thinking about myself instead of him. You've been the truest friend I think I've ever had. Misha blushed. I'm glad, she said shyly. That's the kind of friend I've always tried to be. I can't say I've been as true a friend, Smuggins said. I think the king would do anything for his friend, even give up his own life. I've never been tested, and I'd like to think that I would go so far for you, but I don't know what I would do. We can never know beforehand how we'll react when a situation like that comes. But I know you, Smuggins, Misha said, and I believe you would do anything for a true friend. Smuggins looked over at Misha and smiled. Thank you, he said. The king's friend stayed for 2 more days. When he left, the king said to Daggins, one of the messengers, with him to be sure he reach his destination in safety. After the excitement of the visit, life in the king's courtroom seemed almost dull. But Smuggins found himself occupied thinking about friendship. As he stood in the line of messengers, ready at a moment's notice to step forward and say, At your service, your majesty. Yes, your majesty. He considered what it meant to be a friend. Even as he thought about Misha's friendship and how much it meant to him, he realized that there was another friend for whom he would give his life. The king himself. Certainly he was the king's messenger, but Smuggins knew that the king loved his messengers, and each one of them was willing to pay the ultimate price for him. It was a different kind of friendship, that of a servant and his master, but it was a friendship nonetheless. It was only that evening that Daggins returned to the king's courtroom. He was not expected back so soon, and his entrance into the king's presence caused much surprise. Daggins' clothes were disheveled, and he had bruises on his face. He looked exhausted and limped as he entered the king's courtroom, carrying nothing but a sealed letter in his hand. The king stood as Daggins approached. My messenger! What happened to you? Your Majesty, Daggins stood as straight as he could. We were just a few hours out of the city when your friend ordered his men to take hold of me. One of them said he would teach me a lesson and began to beat me. After a few moments, your friend ordered him to stop and said, We do need the messenger to take a message, remember? Then he pulled me to my feet and handed me this letter. He said, "Take a message to your king." And then he spat on me, and they all mounted their horses and rode off, leaving me in the dust. I came back here as fast as I could. He held out the letter to the king, who reached forward and took it. Opening it, he began to read it silently. As his eyes traveled down the page, it was as if the strength left his legs. His knees buckled, and he groped from his throne. Sitting, he continued to read, tears filling his eyes, the color draining from his face. When he finished reading, he stood again and looked out to those gathered in the courtroom. He was always the better actor of us two, even when we were children. The king's voice broke, and he took a moment to regain his composure before continuing. I read here, in this letter, that the man I have long considered my truest friend had declared himself my enemy. He has had a taste of what it is to be a master, and wants to serve me no longer. He has gone to the north and is raising a small army of followers that he says he will one day bring against me and take my throne. The king's self-possession broke, and sitting, he put his face in his hands and wept as if his heart was broken. Smuggins's own eyes began to sting and soon were overflowing with tears. He let them run down his face without wiping them away. He would mourn with his friend, the king. When the king's tears finally spent themselves, he raised his head and saw Dagon still standing before him, his hands clenched into fists and fire in his eyes. "Daggons," the king spoke, "you wonder why I weep?" "Yes, your majesty, I do," Daggons replied. "I wonder what you do. I wonder that you do not rise up and fight against him right away." The king looked around the room and, seeing Smuggins's tear-drenched face, called him out. "Smuggins, step forth." "Yes, your majesty," Smuggins said, stepping forward. "You have wept with me." "I have, your majesty. Only in these last few days have I really begun to understand friendship, and I weep with you because you are my friend, and because you have been betrayed by a friend." The king stepped off his dais and grasped Dagon's shoulder. "The time to rise and fight will come." Then he turned to Smuggins, and putting his hand on the side of Smuggins's face, the tears began to pour down his cheeks again. "My friend," he said, "you will learn it is those we love most who are able to wound us most deeply." That's the end of chapter 3. I hope you'll join us again on Monday night. Have a good weekend. God bless.